Ray Whittaker has been a name whispered across the internet for years. A man whose presence both fascinates and unsettles people who encounter his story for the first time. For some, he is simply part of a larger narrative, the Whittaker family of Odd, West Virginia. For others, Ray represents something deeper, a mirror reflecting how society responds when disability, poverty, and isolation intersect in one place. But beneath the viral clips, the debates, and the reactions, another question has been growing quietly in the background. Not who Ray is, but who is actually helping him. Because attention is not the same as support, and visibility is not the same as care. The internet has watched the Whittaker family for years. Watched their home, their routines, their struggles, their differences. Watch Ray move through a world that few viewers fully understand. And as that attention grew, so did something else. Intervention, money, supplies, people arriving with cameras, with questions, with offers. But when you slow the story down, when you remove the noise of viral attention, a more difficult question begins to take shape. Where does help begin? And where does it change into something else? The Whittaker family did not enter the public eye through institutions. They were not introduced through a clinical report. They were not presented through a structured welfare system. They were introduced through a camera, through the work of Mark Leiter, whose interviews and documentation brought millions of viewers into a place they had never seen before. For many, it felt like exposure. For others, it felt like intrusion. But regardless of interpretation, one thing is clear. The moment the camera arrived, the conditions around the Whittakers began to change. At first, that change appeared positive. Viewers sent money. Donations increased. Basic supplies began to reach the home. Food, clothing, household items, things that had been limited suddenly became more accessible. And in a region where systemic support had been inconsistent, that kind of attention can feel like relief. But relief is not structure. It is temporary. It depends on continuity. And continuity depends on something more stable than attention. This is where the story becomes more complicated. Because the help coming in was not centralized. It was not coordinated by a single system. It came from multiple directions. Different creators. Different audiences. Different intentions. Some people wanted to assist. Some wanted to document. Some wanted to expose. Some wanted to be part of the story. And when multiple motivations converge around a vulnerable family, the result is rarely simple. There is no single plan, no unified oversight, no clear boundaries separating support from influence. So the question becomes more precise. When help arrives without structure, who manages it? Who decides what is needed? Who ensures it is used correctly? Who protects the people receiving it? In traditional systems, those roles are defined. Social workers, healthcare providers, legal guardians, institutions designed, at least in theory, to create accountability. But the Whittakers did not initially exist inside those systems. They existed outside of them, which means the responsibility for managing help often fell on individuals within the family. People who were already dealing with caregiving, people without formal training, people navigating poverty, isolation, and constant attention at the same time. And that creates pressure, because managing resources is not the same as receiving them. It requires decisions, planning, prioritization, and when those decisions are made under public scrutiny, every outcome becomes visible. Every choice becomes open to interpretation. And interpretation, especially online, is rarely neutral. Some viewers believed the help was improving the family's situation. Others believed it was being mismanaged. Others questioned whether the presence of cameras was influencing how resources were used. And once those questions begin, they do not stay contained. They expand. They divide audiences. They create competing narratives. One side sees assistance. Another sees exploitation. One side sees awareness. Another sees performance. And in the middle of all of it, the Whittaker family continues to live their daily lives. This is where something important needs to be acknowledged. Helping a family like the Whittakers is not a simple act. It is not solved by money alone. It is not solved by exposure alone. It requires consistency, medical support, environmental stability, long-term planning, communication strategies, and most importantly, it requires understanding the specific needs of the individuals involved. Ray's needs are not generic. They are precise. He requires structured care, predictable routines, familiar environments, caregivers who understand his signals, support systems that can adapt to his communication style. And those needs do not disappear when attention arrives. If anything, they become more sensitive. Because increased attention introduces new variables, new people, new stimuli, new disruptions. And for someone like Ray, disruption is not neutral. It is stress. It is confusion. It is disorientation. So while the outside world focused on helping, another question remained largely unanswered. Was the form of help aligned with what Ray actually needed? Or was it aligned with what was visible? Because visible problems attract visible solutions. But not all needs are visible. Some are quiet, routine-based, context-dependent. And those are the needs most easily overlooked in a public narrative. This is where the idea of behind the scenes becomes critical. Because what the public sees is not the full picture. It is a curated version, a series of moments selected and shared. But real support does not exist in moments. It exists in continuity, in what happens when the camera is off, when there is no audience, when the routines continue without observation. That is where real care is measured. And that is also where the least information exists. So the story begins to split into two layers. The visible layer and the invisible one. The visible layer shows help arriving. The invisible layer determines whether that help becomes stability. And those two layers do not always align. Because visibility operates on attention, but stability operates on consistency. And consistency is difficult to maintain when the system providing support is not structured, when it depends on ongoing interest, when it depends on continued engagement, when it depends on people who are not formally accountable. This is not a condemnation. It is a structural observation, because even well-intentioned help can become unstable if it is not organized. And instability, in a life like Ray's, carries consequences. So before moving forward, the question has to be asked again. Not emotionally, not reactively, but carefully. Who is actually helping the Whittakers? Not in clips, not in moments, but over time. Because in stories like this, the difference between help and harm is rarely found in intention. It is found in outcome, and outcomes take time to reveal themselves. Which means the real answer to that question is not immediate. It unfolds slowly, often out of view, and sometimes too late to correct easily once it becomes clear. What does help actually look like in a situation like this? Because the word itself is deceptively simple. It suggests improvement, relief, progress. But in complex environments, where disability, poverty, and public attention intersect, help is not a single action. It is a system. And if that system is incomplete, inconsistent, or misunderstood, it can produce results that look like help on the surface, while failing underneath. The first layer of help that reached the Whittakers was financial. Donations, direct support from viewers, money sent with the intention of improving living conditions. This is often the fastest form of intervention in public cases. It requires no infrastructure, no formal approval, no waiting period. It moves quickly from intention to action. And in the short term, it works. Food becomes more available. Clothing improves. Immediate needs are addressed. But money alone does not organize itself. It does not decide how it should be used. It does not create long-term plans. It does not replace systems that were never there to begin with. Which means the impact of financial help depends entirely on how it is managed. And that is where complexity begins. Because managing resources in a stable environment is already difficult. Managing them in a setting shaped by long-term poverty, limited access to services, and constant external scrutiny is significantly harder. Every decision becomes amplified. Every purchase becomes visible. Every perceived mistake becomes a point of criticism. And criticism, especially from a distance, often lacks context. Viewers see outcomes. They do not see constraints. They see what was done. They do not see what options were available. So judgments form quickly. Some people believe the money improved the family's life. Others believe it was not used effectively. Others question whether enough structure existed to ensure it could be used effectively at all. And none of these perspectives can be fully resolved from the outside, because the necessary information is not fully visible. This is where the second layer of help emerges. Physical intervention, repairs, improvements to the home, changes to the environment. These actions are more tangible, more measurable. A repaired structure can be seen. A clean space can be documented. A new appliance can be verified. And that visibility creates a sense of progress. Something has changed. Something has improved. But again, the question returns. Is the improvement sustainable? Because a repaired home still requires maintenance. A cleaner space still requires upkeep. And upkeep requires time, energy, and consistency. If those elements are not stable, the improvement risks becoming temporary. This is not a failure of intention. It is a limitation of structure, and structure is what determines whether help lasts. The third layer of help is less visible, but far more critical. Medical and developmental support. This includes access to doctors, specialists, therapists, evaluations, structured care plans. For someone like Ray, this layer is not optional. It is foundational, because without consistent medical oversight, underlying conditions remain unmanaged. Without communication support, expressive limitations remain unaddressed. Without structured care, daily routines rely entirely on informal systems. And informal systems, no matter how dedicated, cannot replace professional support entirely. The challenge is that this layer is the hardest to provide. It requires access, transportation, funding, coordination, and in rural areas, all of those factors are limited. So even with increased attention and resources, establishing consistent medical support is not immediate. It takes time, and time is often the one thing these situations do not have in abundance. This is where the gap between intention and outcome becomes most visible. People want to help. They send resources. They raise awareness. But awareness does not automatically translate into infrastructure. And without infrastructure, help remains fragmented. This leads to the fourth layer, advocacy. Who is speaking for the Whittakers in systems that require formal representation? Who is ensuring that medical needs are documented properly? Who is coordinating between different forms of support? Who is protecting the family from misinformation, mismanagement, or external pressure? In structured environments, these roles are assigned. Social workers, case managers, legal advocates. But in this situation, those roles were not clearly defined at the beginning, which means they were partially filled by whoever stepped forward. Content creators, supporters, individuals with varying levels of experience and understanding. And this introduces risk, because advocacy requires precision. It requires knowledge of systems. It requires accountability. Without those elements, advocacy can become inconsistent, well-intentioned, but unstable. And instability, once again, affects outcomes. This is where another pattern begins to appear. The difference between helping a story and helping a person. Helping a story is visible. It generates engagement. It spreads awareness. It invites participation. Helping a person is slower, quieter, less visible. It requires patience, consistency, and often a willingness to operate without recognition. In the case of the Whittakers, both forms of help appeared simultaneously. The story was being amplified, and the individuals within it were receiving support. But those two processes do not always align. Because what benefits the story does not always benefit the person. A story thrives on visibility. A person, especially someone like Ray, thrives on stability. And visibility can disrupt stability. More visitors, more noise, more change. For someone dependent on routine, those changes are not neutral. They are disruptive. So the question becomes sharper. At what point does helping the story begin to interfere with helping the person? There is no single answer, but the tension is real, and it is visible in how the situation evolved. As the tension increased, so did pressure on the family, on the caregivers, on the individuals involved in providing support. Different voices began to compete. Different interpretations emerged. Some argued that the family needed more intervention. Others argued they needed privacy. Some believed the exposure was necessary. Others believed it was harmful. And in the middle of that debate, decisions had to be made. Real decisions, affecting real people, often without complete information. This is where the concept of behind the scenes becomes even more important. Because what the public sees is not where most decisions happen. Those decisions occur privately, in conversations, in assessments, in evaluations that are not broadcast. And without access to those processes, the public narrative remains incomplete. This does not mean nothing is happening. It means what is happening is not fully visible, which creates uncertainty. And uncertainty invites speculation. Speculation invites division. And division complicates support. Because instead of a unified approach, multiple competing approaches emerge, each claiming to be the correct one, each attempting to influence the outcome. This is where institutional involvement begins to shift the structure. When authorities or formal systems enter the situation, the nature of help changes. It becomes regulated, documented, monitored. There are standards, protocols, accountability mechanisms. From one perspective, this increases stability. It ensures that certain needs are consistently addressed. It reduces reliance on informal systems. From another perspective, it introduces disruption, new environments, new caregivers, new routines. And for someone like Ray, that transition is not simple. It is not just a change in care. It is a change in context. And context is everything in his ability to function. So even structured help carries trade-offs. More oversight, less familiarity, more consistency, less continuity with past routines. And this is where the idea of a perfect solution begins to dissolve. Because none exists. Only different configurations of support. Each with benefits, each with costs. The goal, ideally, is to find a balance. But balance requires coordination. And coordination requires something that has been difficult to maintain in this case. A single, stable system guiding the process. Without that, help remains distributed, fragmented, dependent on multiple actors. And when multiple actors are involved, alignment becomes difficult. Different priorities, different timelines, different definitions of success, all operating simultaneously. So the question returns again. Who is actually helping the Whittakers? The answer is no longer simple. It is not one person, not one group, not one system. It is a network, loose, evolving, sometimes aligned, sometimes conflicting. And within that network, some forms of help are visible, others are not. Some are immediate, others take time. Some address symptoms, others attempt to address underlying conditions. And all of them interact, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes interfering. Which means the real evaluation of help cannot be based on isolated actions. It has to be based on patterns. Over time, are conditions improving consistently? Is stability increasing? Are needs being met more reliably? Is communication being better supported? Is stress being reduced? These are the indicators that matter. Not momentary changes, not single interventions, but sustained outcomes. And those outcomes are still developing, still unfolding, still unclear in some areas. Which brings the story to a critical point. Because understanding who is helping requires waiting long enough to see what remains. After attention fades, after interventions settle, after routines stabilize again, that is when the answer becomes visible. Not in headlines, not in clips, but in the quiet continuation of daily life. And until that point is reached, the question remains open. Not unanswered, but incomplete. And that incompleteness is not a failure of the story. It is the reality of it. Because attention does not just observe. It reshapes. Not all at once. Not always visibly, but consistently. The Whittaker family did not receive help in isolation. They received it under observation. Every improvement, every change, every decision existed within a public frame. And that frame introduced pressure, not necessarily intentional, but unavoidable. Because once people are watching, expectations form. Viewers begin to anticipate progress. They look for signs of improvement. They compare before and after. They measure outcomes against what they believe should happen. And when those expectations are not met clearly or quickly, questions emerge. Why hasn't more changed? Where's the money going? Who is responsible? These questions are not inherently wrong, but they are often asked without full context. And context matters, because change in a situation like this does not move at the speed of attention. It moves at the speed of capacity. Medical systems take time. Environmental changes take time. Behavioral stability takes time. And most importantly, adaptation takes time. Especially for someone like Ray, whose entire experience of the world is structured around familiarity. When that structure is altered, even slightly, the effects are not always immediate. They can appear later, in withdrawal, in reduced responsiveness, in subtle changes that are easy to misinterpret. This is where attention begins to interfere with interpretation, because viewers tend to focus on what is visible. Expressions, movements, reactions. But those visible signals are influenced by invisible factors. Stress, fatigue, overstimulation. And without understanding those factors, interpretation becomes unstable. A quiet moment might be read as calm, or as distress. A lack of response might be seen as indifference, or as overwhelm. The same behavior can carry different meanings depending on context, and context is rarely fully visible. This is where the role of the camera becomes more complex. It is no longer just documenting. It is shaping what is seen, what is repeated, what becomes representative. If certain moments are captured more often, they begin to define the narrative, even if they are not the full picture. And over time, those selected moments become the version of reality most people recognize. This creates a feedback loop. The more a specific type of moment is shared, the more it is expected. The more it is expected, the more it is noticed. And the more it is noticed, the more it is reinforced. This is how simplified narratives stabilize, even in complex situations. For the Whittakers, this meant that help itself became part of the narrative. Not just something happening in the background, but something observed, evaluated, and debated in real time. People began to assess not only the family, but the helpers, questioning motives, questioning methods, questioning outcomes. And once that layer is added, the system becomes more fragile. Because now help is not only about effectiveness, it is also about perception. And perception can influence behavior. Decisions may be made differently under observation. Not necessarily wise, but differently. More cautious, more reactive, more aware of how actions will be interpreted. And that awareness can shift priorities from what is needed to what is expected. This is the quiet pressure of visibility. It does not announce itself, but it shapes outcomes. And for someone like Ray, who cannot adjust to these pressures consciously, the impact is indirect. It arrives through changes in environment, changes in routine, changes in how others behave around him, which means the system of help is not operating in a neutral space. It is operating inside attention. And attention, by its nature, is unstable. It grows, it shifts, it fades. And when it fades, the question becomes unavoidable. What remains when no one is watching? Because that is where help is tested. Not in moments of visibility, but in continuity. And continuity cannot depend on attention. It is to exist without it. Which brings the story to a quieter, more difficult point. The difference between temporary support and lasting care. And that difference is not determined by how much is given, but by how long it holds. If attention shapes help, then Part 4 has to confront what happens when that attention begins to trigger formal intervention. Because there is a threshold in cases like this. A point where observation turns into responsibility, where concern becomes action, where systems that were once distant begin to move closer. For the Whittaker family, the threshold appears to have been crossed gradually, not in a single moment, but through accumulation. Concerns about living conditions, concerns about health, concerns about long-term care. Each one, on its own, might not force immediate action, but together they begin to form a pattern, and systems respond to patterns, not impressions, not opinions, patterns. When that response begins, the structure of help changes completely. It moves from informal to formal, from flexible to regulated, from voluntary to monitored. This is where institutions enter, not as observers, but as decision-makers. And with that shift comes a new set of priorities. Documentation, assessment, risk evaluation, standards of care. These are not optional inside institutional systems. They are required, which means the situation is no longer being evaluated based on perception alone. It is being measured against defined criteria. And once that happens, outcomes become more predictable, but also more rigid. Because formal systems are designed to reduce uncertainty. They do not adapt as easily to individual nuance. They follow protocols. They apply guidelines. They prioritize safety and stability, sometimes over familiarity. For someone like Ray, this introduces a fundamental trade-off. The environment may become safer, cleaner, more structured, but it also becomes unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is not a minor factor in his life. It is central. His ability to function depends heavily on recognition, on routine, on people who understand his patterns of communication. When those elements change, even if the overall care improves, the immediate experience can become more difficult. This is where the concept of improvement becomes complicated. Because improvement from an external perspective does not always align with comfort from an internal one. A system can be objectively better and still feel disruptive. This is not a contradiction. It is a difference in perspective. And both perspectives matter. The institutional view focuses on measurable outcomes, health indicators, environmental safety, consistency of care. These are essential, but they do not fully capture lived experience. They do not measure familiarity. They do not measure emotional continuity. They do not measure how a person like Ray interprets change. And without that understanding, decisions can feel complete from the outside, while remaining incomplete from within. This is where the role of caregivers becomes critical again. Because even within structured systems, individual attention matters. Consistency in who interacts with him. Consistency in how communication is interpreted. Consistency in daily routines. These are the elements that can bridge the gap between structure and familiarity. But they require time. And time, once again, becomes the limiting factor. Adjustment does not happen immediately. It unfolds gradually. Through repetition, through exposure, through rebuilding patterns that were disrupted. And during that process, there's often a period of instability. A period where behavior may change, where responsiveness may decrease, where signals become harder to interpret. Not because the person has changed fundamentally, but because the context has. This is where interpretation becomes especially delicate. Observers may see withdrawal, reduced engagement, differences in behavior, and those changes can be read in multiple ways. As decline, as adjustment, as stress, as adaptation. Without direct insight into Ray's internal experience, those interpretations remain uncertain, which means caution is required, not assumptions, because the risk of misreading behavior is highest during periods of transition. And this transition is not minor. It is structural, from an informal, familiar environment to a formal, regulated one. That is not a small shift. It is a reconfiguration of daily life. And reconfiguration takes time to stabilize. This is where the earlier question returns again. Who is helping? At this stage, the answer includes institutions, professionals, systems designed to provide consistent care. But even here, the answer is not complete. Because help is not only about provision. It is about alignment. Does the care being provided match what Ray needs to feel stable? Does it account for his communication style? Does it preserve as much continuity as possible while improving conditions? These are the questions that determine effectiveness. Not just the presence of help, but the quality of it. And those questions cannot be answered immediately. They require observation over time, which means the story has not reached a conclusion. It has entered a different phase, less visible, more structured, but still unresolved. Because even when systems take over, understanding does not automatically follow. At the end of this story, the question does not disappear. It sharpens. Because after the attention, after the debates, after the interventions, one uncertainty remains intact. What does real help look like for someone who cannot fully explain what they need? Ray Whittaker's life has been shaped by people making decisions around him. Family, viewers, creators, institutions, each one acting from a position of interpretation, trying to understand, trying to respond, trying, in their own way, to help. But interpretation is not certainty. And when a person cannot confirm or correct what is being decided for them, every action carries a degree of risk, even well-intentioned ones. That is the quiet weight at the center of this story. Not whether help exists. It does. Not whether people care. They do. But whether that care aligns with the reality of the person receiving it. Because help, at its core, is not defined by effort. It is defined by outcome, by whether stability increases, by whether distress decreases, by whether the person becomes more secure in their environment, not less. And those outcomes do not appear instantly. They emerge slowly, often without visibility, often without recognition. So the final question is not directed at one person or one system. It extends outward, to anyone who watches, to anyone who responds, to anyone who believes they are helping. Are we supporting the person or reacting to the story? Because those are not always the same thing. And in cases like this, the difference matters more than anything else. If help is real, it will remain when attention fades. If it is not, it will disappear with it. And for Ray, the answer to that question is not something he can say. It is something that will be revealed quietly, over time. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.